Picture this: a single sheet of parchment, glowing under the flicker of candlelight, covered in swirls of gold and vivid colors so rich they seem to breathe. Each curve of ink, each delicate brushstroke was placed by hand, not in days or weeks, but sometimes years of relentless focus. This wasn't just writing, it was an act of reverence, a sacred dance between art and devotion. Welcome to the world of illuminated manuscripts, where medieval scribes transformed words into windows of the divine. These weren't mere books. They were treasures of human ingenuity, crafted in silence by hands that history almost forgot. Think about the last time you held a book, the crisp pages, the effortless print. Now imagine every letter, every flourish, drawn by hand with a quill dipped in homemade ink. No erasers, no shortcuts, just patience so profound it borders on the spiritual. These scribes worked in scriptoriums, often freezing cold and dimly lit, hunched over desks for hours that bled into days. Their tools were simple: a knife to sharpen quills, a ruler to guide lines, pigments ground from precious stones. But their vision was boundless. They didn't just copy texts, they brought them to life with illustrations so intricate they could make a modern artist pause in awe. But here's what's truly astonishing. These manuscripts weren't just pretty decorations. They were the hard drives of the medieval world, safeguarding knowledge through wars, plagues, and the slow march of centuries. Biblical stories, scientific theories, even recipes for medicine, all survived because scribes dedicated their lives to preserving them. And yet, we rarely hear their names. Today, we're pulling back the veil on these unsung heroes. We'll explore the secrets hidden in the margins of their work, the symbolism woven into every gilded letter, and the sheer determination it took to create something timeless. This is a story about artistry, faith, and the quiet power of preserving light in the darkest of ages. So settle in. You're about to discover why these scribes were far more than just copyists. They were keepers of civilization itself. To understand how illuminated manuscripts came to be, we have to travel back to the fading days of the Roman Empire. Picture the great libraries of antiquity crumbling, their scrolls rotting away. Knowledge itself seemed on the brink of vanishing. Into this void stepped early Christian monks, who saw books not just as containers of words, but as sacred vessels. They began copying texts by hand, first on fragile papyrus, then on more durable parchment made from animal skins. But here, where the magic happened, they didn't stop at mere transcription. Drawing from the vibrant traditions of Celtic metalwork, Byzantine mosaics, and even Islamic calligraphy, these scribes started framing their words with intricate borders, weaving tiny illustrations between the lines like hidden gems. Take the Book of Kells, created around the year 800 on a remote island off Scotland's coast. Open its pages, and you'll find Latin scriptures transformed into a riot of color, interlacing snakes, spirals that seem to spin off the page, even portraits of saints with expressions so alive they could step right out of the parchment. What's astonishing isn't just the skill, but the purpose behind it. Every swirl of ink was a meditation, a prayer made visible. These monks believed beauty could elevate the soul, so they poured their devotion into every stroke. Yet monasteries weren't just quiet retreats for art, they were powerhouses of production. Scriptoriums buzzed with activity, teams of scribes working in shifts by candlelight. Some mixed pigments from lapis lazuli hauled across deserts from Afghanistan, or gold leaf so thin it clung to the page like sunlight. Others pricked tiny holes along the edges of sheets to guide the lettering, a medieval version of ruled paper. And the cost? A single manuscript could equal the price of a small farm, which explains why only kings, bishops, or the wealthiest nobles could afford them. But these books weren't just status symbols. In an age when most people couldn't read, the illustrations acted as a visual sermon. A peasant might not understand Latin, but they could grasp the story of Adam and Eve from a single glowing miniature. That's why these manuscripts became such potent tools. They bridged the gap between the literate elite and the masses, wrapping theology in gold and crimson. By the 12th century, this art form had spread like wildfire, from Ireland's misty cloisters to the courts of Charlemagne. What began as a desperate act of preservation had blossomed into one of humanity's most dazzling creative achievements, a testament to how light can emerge from even the darkest ages. Imagine spending your entire childhood mastering the art of handwriting before you were even allowed to touch a manuscript. That was the reality for medieval scribes, who often entered monastery schools as young boys, spending years learning the alphabet before progressing to full texts. Their training was grueling, hours of practicing strokes on wax tablets, memorizing complex scripts like Carolingian minuscule, where every letter had to be uniform down to the millimeter. One misaligned stroke, and their master might make them start the entire page over. This wasn't just education, it was a test of endurance. Once trained, a scribe's daily routine was anything but glamorous. Picture a dimly lit scriptorium in midwinter, fingers stiff from the cold, breath visible in the air as they hunched over their writing desk. The only light came from high windows or flickering candles, casting shadows that made their delicate work even harder. Their tools were humble but required extraordinary skill. A quill cut from a goose feather, ink brewed from oak galls and iron salts, and vellum scraped so thin it was almost translucent. Every material was precious. A single sheet of vellum could take days to prepare, and gold leaf was so expensive that scribes would often blow the excess specks back into a container to reuse. Mistakes weren't just frustrating, they were disasters. There were no erasers, no delete keys. A misplaced stroke might mean scraping the entire page clean with a knife, risking damage to the delicate surface. Some scribes got creative, turning their errors into tiny doodles, a smiling face peeking from a margin, a playful monster swallowing a misspelled word. These glosses, as they were called, are like hidden messages from the past, showing us the scribes' humor and humanity beneath the solemn task. Yet despite their painstaking work, most scribes never signed their names. They saw themselves as vessels, not artists, channeling divine words rather than claiming ownership. A few left subtle marks, an initial tucked into a corner, a colophon at the end with a humble prayer. One scribe in a French monastery even scribbled in the margin, "The ink is thin, the parchment is hairy, and the day is dark." Across centuries, you can almost hear his exhaustion. What's remarkable is how much these anonymous hands accomplished. A single Bible could take a scribe over a year to complete, and libraries held thousands of volumes, each one letter by letter. Their work didn't just preserve texts, it shaped how knowledge was organized, with punctuation, chapter headings, and even early forms of footnotes emerging from their innovations. When we flip through a book today, we're using systems these scribes invented. Their legacy isn't just in the pages they filled. but in the mindset they embodied. In a world without shortcuts, they understood that greatness lies in showing up, day after day, to do the work, even when no one remembers your name. Every illuminated manuscript is a testament to that quiet, stubborn faith in the power of small, perfect acts. Beneath every shimmering page of an illuminated manuscript lies a hidden world of alchemy and craftsmanship. Take vellum, for instance, not ordinary paper, but the skin of calves, sheep, or goats, treated through a process so meticulous it bordered on ritual. The finest skins were soaked in lime, stretched on wooden frames, and scraped with moon-shaped knives until they reached a buttery smoothness. A single large manuscript might require the hides of an entire herd, each sheet a silent testament to the animals that made such permanence possible. Then there was the ink, no simple black liquid, but a brew steeped in medieval science. Iron gall ink, the scribe's staple, was concocted from oak galls, those strange growths formed by wasp larvae on tree bark. Crushed and mixed with iron salts, they produced a deep, enduring black that darkened over time, as if the words themselves were alive. But the real magic lay in the colors. Ultramarine blue, more precious than gold, came from lapis lazuli mined in distant Afghanistan. Reds were drawn from crushed kermes insects or mercury-rich cinnabar, greens from malachite or verdigris scraped off copper pots. Each pigment carried its own story, a globe's worth of minerals and trade routes ground into powder on the scribe's work table. And then there was the gold, not painted, but laid leaf by leaf, each wafer-thin sheet pressed onto sticky gesso or honey-based adhesive. The scribe would burnish it with a polished agate or even a wolf's tooth, transforming flat metal into a surface that seemed to emit its own light. In candlelit churches, these gilded letters would flicker as if divine messages were emerging from the page itself. What's astonishing isn't just the materials, but the labor behind them. A scribe might wait months for a shipment of lapis lazuli to arrive by camel caravan, then spend days grinding it with a mortar and pestle. Gold leaf was so delicate that a gust of wind could ruin hours of work. Even the humble quill required skill, a goose feather cured in sand or hot ash, its tip cut at just the right angle to glide across vellum without catching. Yet these weren't just practical choices, they were spiritual ones. Medieval scribes believed their materials carried symbolic weight. Vellum, cleansed of hair and blemishes, mirrored the soul purified for God. Gold reflected heavenly radiance, while the deep blues of lapis evoked the Virgin Mary's robes. Every step, from scraping hides to mixing inks, was a meditation on transformation, taking the raw stuff of earth and turning it into something transcendent. Surviving manuscripts still bear traces of this devotion. Run a finger across a gilded initial, if you're allowed, and you'll feel the slight ridge where centuries-old gold still rises from the page. Peer closely at a margin, and you might spot the faintest thumbprint of a scribe who leaned too close before the ink dried. These tiny imperfections remind us that behind every flawless page were human hands, calloused, patient, and achingly precise. In an age of mass production, it's hard to grasp the value of such labor. A single illuminated manuscript wasn't just a book. It was a small cosmos of craft, blending the work of tanners, miners, chemists, and artists across continents. When we marvel at these pages today, we're not just seeing colors and letters. We're witnessing the stubborn, radiant persistence of beauty in a world that had every reason to cut corners. Creating an illuminated manuscript was like conducting a symphony. every movement precise, every contributor essential. It began with the scribe's steady hand, measuring out margins and lines with a stylus, pressing faint guidelines into the vellum that would later vanish under ink. These weren't haphazard scratches, but a carefully calculated grid, ensuring each letter would sit in perfect harmony with the illustrations to come. Imagine the pressure. One misaligned line, and the entire page's balance could crumble. Next came the illustrators, wielding lead or silver point to sketch scenes so delicate they looked like spiderwebs caught on parchment. These underdrawings were the skeleton of the masterpiece, figures of saints with flowing robes, vines twisting into biblical symbols, even whimsical creatures hiding in initials. Some artists worked from pattern books, copying popular motifs, while others invented on the spot, their creativity bubbling into the margins. But here's what's fascinating. Many sketches were never meant to be seen. They'd be buried under layers of paint, like secrets between the artist and the page. Then color flooded in, not slapped on haphazardly, but built like architecture. A base layer of tempera made from egg yolk and pigment gave the art its body. Then came translucent glazes, thin as stained glass, letting light dance through shades of crimson or emerald. The pigments weren't just mixed, they were alchemized. Blues might be layered over greens to mimic the shifting hues of a peacock's feather, while reds deepened with each coat until they glowed like coals. And mistakes. Nearly impossible to fix. A slip of the brush could mean scraping the entire section clean. But the true showstopper was the gold. Applied not with a brush, but with breath and patience, gold leaf was laid over tacky gesso, then polished until it mirrored the sun. Some scribes used their own cheeks to warm the agate burnisher, pressing it gently to make the metal sing. The effect was hypnotic, letters that shimmered when candles flickered, turning pages into tiny theaters of light. This wasn't a solo act. Scribes passed pages to illustrators, who handed them to gilders, who then sent them to binders stitching everything into codices. Each expert was a link in a chain stretching across workshops, sometimes even countries. A single manuscript might bear the hands of a dozen artisans, yet feel as cohesive as a single thought. And that's the miracle of these books. They weren't just read, they were experienced. A reader tracing the curve of a gilded letter might feel the same awe as someone entering a cathedral, surrounded by beauty that whispered of something greater. The scribes and artists knew this. They didn't just make books, they built bridges between earth and heaven, one luminous page at a time. Religion didn't just influence illuminated manuscripts, it breathed life into them. Every stroke of ink, every gleam of gold was an act of devotion. Picture a monk in a chilly scriptorium, hunched over a psalm. To him, this wasn't just copying, it was prayer in physical form. The words he transcribed were sacred, and the beauty he added, a vine curling around a capital letter, a saint's face emerging from pigment, was his way of honoring the divine. These manuscripts weren't mere books. They were instruments of worship, designed to elevate the soul as much as inform the mind. Take the Psalter of St. Louis, commissioned by a French king in the 13th century. Its pages burst with scenes of David playing the harp, his fingers almost seeming to pluck the strings across the vellum. But look closer. The borders teem with tiny battles, grotesques, even hunting scenes. At first glance, they might seem whimsical, but they're deliberate. The artist wove the secular and sacred together, reminding viewers that faith wasn't confined to church walls. Even a king's daily life, his hunts and wars, could be threaded into the tapestry of devotion. The church's role in this can't be overstated. Monasteries were the beating hearts of manuscript production, but cathedrals and wealthy bishops bankrolled the most lavish volumes. A single Bible might cost as much as a village's yearly harvest, paid for by patrons eager to secure spiritual favor. These books were status symbols, yes, but also acts of penance or gratitude. A noblewoman might fund a psalter to commemorate a deceased husband, her grief transformed into gilded prayers. What's remarkable is how these manuscripts bridged the gap between clergy and laity. Most medieval Christians couldn't read Latin, but they could read the images. A peasant kneeling in a cathedral might not understand the Mass, but a stained glass window or an illuminated page showed them Christ's miracles in vivid color. Artists became theologians, distilling complex doctrines into visual sermons. The Annunciation wasn't just words. It was an angel's golden wings, Mary's blue robes, painted with that priceless lapis lazuli, a dove descending in rays of light. Symbolism hid in plain sight. A pelican piercing its own breast to feed its young. That was Christ's sacrifice. A unicorn resting in a maiden's lap, the Incarnation. Even the colors carried meaning, red for martyrdom, green for renewal, white for purity. Nothing was arbitrary. A scribe might spend hours perfecting the Chi-Rho symbol, knowing those intertwined Greek letters represented the very name of Christ. Yet these works weren't frozen in solemnity. Flip to the margins, and you'll find rabbits jousting, monkeys playing trumpets, even monks sneaking kisses. These so-called drolleries weren't blasphemous, they were human. Scribes and artists acknowledged the messy, playful side of life, even as they celebrated the sacred. It's a reminder that faith in the Middle Ages wasn't just about austerity, it was about wonder. By the late medieval period, illuminated manuscripts had become a mirror of the church itself. Opulent, intricate, sometimes contradictory. A single page could hold a bloody crucifixion alongside a whimsical border of acrobats, because to the medieval mind, the divine and the everyday weren't separate. They were intertwined, just like the gold and ink on the page. When we hold these manuscripts today, we're not just holding art. We're holding a 1,000-year-old conversation between heaven and earth. While monasteries guarded sacred texts, castles and courts buzzed with manuscripts of a different kind, pages alive with jousting knights, mythical beasts, and the quiet dramas of daily life. Secular illumination wasn't a rebellion against religion. It was an expansion, proving that beauty and meaning could thrive beyond chapel walls. Take The Riches Berry, a 15th century masterpiece that reads like a medieval Instagram feed. Its calendar pages burst with scenes of peasants harvesting wheat under summer skies, nobles feasting in tapestried halls, and even snowball fights in winter. Each month a snapshot of a world both familiar and fantastical. Here, piety shared space with practicality, like a prayer book doubling as a farmer's almanac. Legal documents, too, got the golden treatment. Imagine a royal charter, its stiff Latin clauses framed by fluttering banners and heraldic beasts. These weren't just pretty decorations, they were power plays. A king's seal might loom over the text, reminding anyone who read it that authority came from God and from the gilded might of the crown. Even dry tax records sometimes sprouted marginal doodles, a grumpy scribe's commentary on the endless paperwork. Then there were the romances, where love and legend collided in swirling pigments. The Lancelot Grail cycle transformed Arthurian tales into visual feasts, knights in shimmering armor, enchanted forests where every leaf curled with meticulous care, and tragic heroines whose gowns bled crimson onto the vellum. These weren't just stories, they were escapism for nobility, their fantastical plots mirroring the chivalric ideals of the court. Medical manuscripts offered another surprise: anatomy lessons wrapped in artistry. Herbal guides painted rosemary and sage with such precision, you could almost smell them through the page. Surgeons' manuals, gruesomely detailed, showed diagrams of wounds alongside delicate floral borders, as if to soften the blow of their grim practicality. What unites these secular works is their humanity. A monk might illuminate to glorify God, but a court artist painted to delight, to persuade, even to gossip. The margins of a noblewoman's book of hours might hide a mischievous monkey stealing fruit, a private joke between artist and patron. A chronicle of battles could turn into a propaganda piece, with gilded victories overshadowing messy realities. This diversity proves illuminated manuscripts weren't relics locked in cloisters. They were living, breathing extensions of medieval minds, capable of sacred one moment and worldly wit the next. When we flip past the Bible pages and into these secular treasures, we don't just see the Middle Ages through stained glass. We see them through open windows, where the wind carries laughter, ink, and the restless creativity of a world learning to tell its own story. Flip to any random page of an illuminated manuscript, and your eye might first catch the gleaming gold letters or vibrant biblical scenes. But pause for just a moment. Let your gaze drift to the margins. That's where the real magic happens. Tucked between solemn scriptures and saints' portraits, you'll find a riot of tiny creatures grinning back at you. Snails jousting on horseback, monkeys dressed as bishops, even dragons locked in absurd battles with knights no bigger than a fingernail. These weren't doodles. They were a secret language, a medieval emoji set hiding in plain sight. Take the humble snail. Scrolling through manuscripts from England to Italy, you'll spot them everywhere, often armored like knights, lances raised in mock heroic combat. Scholars still debate their meaning. Were they symbols of cowardice, their slow retreat into shells poking fun at reluctant warriors? Or inside jokes about the Lombards, a group stereotyped as sluggish by their medieval neighbors? Then there's the fox, frequently shown preaching to geese from a makeshift pulpit, a biting satire of corrupt clergy exploiting their flocks. Even the seemingly random hybrids, rabbits with antlers, fish with wings, weren't just flights of fancy. Many pulled from bestiaries, medieval animal encyclopedias that assigned moral lessons to every creature. A pelican pecking its own breast to feed its young, that was Christ's sacrifice. A phoenix rising from flames, the resurrection itself. But not all marginalia was pious. Some pages burst with pure, anarchic humor. In the Smithfield Decretals, a cat in a monk's robe hears confession from a terrified mouse. The Psalter shows a bare-bottomed man mooning the viewer, while another manuscript features two grotesques playing tug-of-war with a sausage. These weren't disrespectful. They were pressure valves, acknowledging the messy humanity beneath the sacred text. Imagine a monk, weary from copying Leviticus, sneaking in a silly scene to keep his sanity. Centuries later, his private joke still makes us chuckle. The deeper you dig, the more layered it gets. Some motifs acted like medieval memes, recurring across manuscripts with slight variations. The knight versus snail trope pops up so often, it must have been an inside joke everyone understood. Other symbols shifted meaning with context. A monkey could represent lust one moment and human folly the next. Even plants held secrets. Ivy symbolized eternal life, while strawberries stood for righteousness, their three-part leaves echoing the Trinity. What's astonishing is how these tiny details mirror the medieval worldview. Life wasn't neatly divided into sacred and profane. It was a tapestry where the divine and the ridiculous coexisted. A prayer book might solemnly depict the crucifixion on one page, then burst into marginal monkeys stealing fruit on the next. To modern eyes, it seems contradictory. But to the medieval mind, both belonged, the gravity of faith and the levity of being human. Today, these marginalia offer us something rare, an unfiltered glimpse into medieval humor, fears, and imagination. The next time you see a grinning grotesque peeking from a gilded initial, remember, you're not just looking at decoration. You're eavesdropping on a 1,000-year-old conversation where a scribe's quill winked at the future, trusting someone like you would eventually get the joke. Among these legendary manuscripts, the Book of Kells reigns supreme, not just for its age, but for the sheer audacity of its artistry. Created around the year 800 on the remote island of Iona, then later moved to Kells for Viking raids, its pages pulse with energy. Zoom in on any corner, and you'll find spirals within spirals, not so intricate they seem to defy physics, and animals tangled in vines that morph into letters before your eyes. The Chi page alone, marking Christ's name in Greek, is a masterpiece of controlled chaos, every millimeter crammed with swirls, peacocks, and even tiny human faces hiding in the curves. What's staggering isn't just the detail, but the purpose behind it. These Celtic monks believed complexity mirrored the divine. The harder a design was to unravel, the closer it brought you to God's mystery. Then there's the Gospels, a quieter marvel born in 7th century Northumbria, where the Book of Kells explodes with color, whispers in harmony. Its pages blend Celtic with Mediterranean elegance. Roman-style arches frame saints with delicate shading, while Anglo-Saxon beasts gnarl at the margins. This wasn't just artistic fusion, it was political. The manuscript's creator, Bishop, lived in a time when Christianity was stitching together warring kingdoms. His art became a peace treaty in vellum, proving that beauty could bridge cultures. Even the pigments tell a story. The vibrant purples came from mollusks harvested off Phoenician coasts, traded across empires to reach this windswept English isle. But size doesn't always dictate significance. The hours of small enough to fit in a queen's palm holds worlds within its miniature pages. Commissioned in the 14th century for the French queen's private prayers, it's a jewel of Gothic refinement. Scenes of the Nativity or the Crucifixion are rendered with such delicacy. They look embroidered rather than painted. What's revolutionary here is the intimacy. This wasn't a book for public display, but for whispered devotion. Could trace Christ's sorrows with her fingertip, the tiny figures reflecting her own scale, making divinity feel personal. These manuscripts didn't just sit on shelves, they shaped history. The Book of Kells, interlacing patterns resurfaced centuries later in Art Nouveau, inspiring architects like. The Gospels, fusion of styles, prefigured our modern love for cultural remixing. Even's tiny prayers revolutionized book design, proving that luxury could be portable. But their greatest legacy isn't in museums, it's in the way they make us feel. Holding a facsimile of the Cairo page, you're not just seeing art, you're feeling the tremor of a monk's hand as he labored over something meant to outlast empires. These books remind us that brilliance isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet persistence of gold on parchment, whispering across 12 centuries. Look what humans can do when they aim for eternity. Rhythmic scratch of quills on vellum began to fade in the mid-15th century, drowned out by the mechanical clatter of printing press. With a single invention, books, once rare treasures crafted over years, could now be mass-produced in weeks. A Bible that once required a team of scribes a decade to illuminate could roll off the presses by the hundreds, its crisp black letters uniform and affordable. For the first time in history, knowledge wasn't just for the wealthy or the cloistered elite. It was within reach of merchants, students, even farmers. Yet this revolution came at a cost. The press couldn't replicate the luminous gold leaf, the hand-mixed pigments, the playful marginalia that made each manuscript unique. Early printed books looked stark by comparison, rows of text with blank spaces where illuminations might have been. Some printers tried to bridge the gap, leaving room for artists to add hand-painted initials or borders, creating hybrid books that mingled old-world artistry with new-world efficiency. In Mainz, Paris, and Venice, you'd find scribes-turned-illustrators hunched over printed pages, their brushes adding flashes of color to mechanical type. For a few decades, the two worlds coexisted, one foot in the medieval scriptorium, the other in the Renaissance workshop. But the economics were undeniable. A printed book cost a fraction of an illuminated manuscript, and speed mattered in an age hungry for rediscovered classical texts and explosive scientific ideas. By the 1500s, most scribes had become relics, their skills as outdated as in the age of gunpowder. Monasteries, once the guardians of illumination, now housed libraries filled with printed volumes. The very word, manuscript meaning, written by hand became a label for something obsolete. This wasn't just a shift in technology, it was a transformation of thought. The medieval world had revered the book as a sacred object, its beauty a reflection of divine truth. The Renaissance celebrated the book as a vessel for human ideas, prized for content over craftsmanship. Illumination didn't disappear, it migrated. Artists who once gilded gospels now painted portraits for merchant princes or designed woodcuts for printed herbals. The intricate borders of manuscripts found new life in the frames of Renaissance paintings, while the playful grotesques of the margins inspired the era's love of allegory and wit. What's poignant is how many scribes saw the end coming. In the margins of a French manuscript from the 1470s, one monk scrawled a lament. "The printed book is here, and I am undone." Yet even as their art faded, these scribes left behind a final act of defiance, their manuscripts. Unlike the thousands of nearly identical printed books, each illuminated page remained stubbornly, gloriously singular. Today, when we hold one, we're not just holding a book. We're holding the last echo of a world where beauty wasn't a luxury, but a language, one that whispered, even in its twilight, that some things are worth doing slowly, imperfectly, and by hand. Centuries after their creation, illuminated manuscripts face a silent battle against time. The same vellum that survived medieval winters now cracks under modern humidity, while gold leaf dulls with every careless touch. But today's guardians, Conservators in white gloves and lab coats wield tools those monks could never have imagined. Step into the British Library's conservation lab, and you'll find manuscripts resting on cradles of padded foam, bathed in LED lights that mimic daylight without its harmful rays. Humidity is locked at 55%, the sweet spot where parchment stays supple, but mold can't take root. Even the air is filtered, stripping away pollutants that might turn vibrant blues to murky green. Digitization has become another lifeline. High-resolution cameras mounted on robotic arms now capture every brushstroke, every fleck of gold, at resolutions so fine they reveal the grain of the parchment itself. The Vatican Library's ongoing project has brought treasures like the Codex, one of the oldest Bibles in existence, to screens worldwide, letting scholars in Tokyo or Texas study pages too fragile to open. But here's the catch. No scan can replicate the weight of vellum in your hands, the way gold leaf catches light when you tilt the page. Technology preserves content, but it can't bottle the magic of the physical object. Forgers pose another threat. In 2019, a manuscript fragment attributed to the 15th century was revealed as a fake. It's aged, vellum actually modern calfskin treated with tea stains. Conservators now deploy ultraviolet light to spot anachronistic pigments, or DNA testing to verify an animal's species and era. Yet even genuine manuscripts carry scars of their journeys. Some bear knife marks where jewels were off by looters, or water stains from floods that nearly erased them. The Cotton Library's fire of 1731 left the edges of the Beowulf manuscript charred like lace, each word now a puzzle piece painstakingly reassembled. What's truly at stake isn't just art, but memory. These manuscripts are time machines. One monk's doodle of a grumpy cat in the margin tells us he shared our humor, while a wine stain on a choir book hints at a midnight feast during solemn vespers. When conservators work, they're not just repairing pages, they're stitching together the fabric of 1,000 conversations across time. The future of these treasures hinges on balancing access with protection. Some libraries now create exact replicas using 3D printing, down to the texture of the parchment, letting visitors turn digital pages on. Others train new generations in medieval techniques, ensuring the recipes for oak gall ink or gesso aren't lost to history. Because preserving illuminated manuscripts isn't just about saving the past, it's about keeping alive the patient, imperfect, glorious act of creating something meant to outlast us all. The glow of gold leaf and the whisper of quills never truly vanished. They simply found new canvases. In the heart of Minnesota, a team of artists and scholars spent over 15 years crafting the St. John's Bible, the first fully illuminated handwritten Bible since the invention of the printing press. Its pages shimmer with the same lapis lazuli blues and burnished golds that medieval monks would recognize, yet they mingle with modern touches. DNA helices spiraling in the margins, galaxies swirling behind prophets' visions. This isn't imitation. It's a conversation across centuries, proving that illumination isn't trapped in the past, but thrives wherever hands commit to slow, sacred work. Beyond sacred texts, the aesthetic of illuminated manuscripts pulses through unexpected corners of contemporary culture. Graphic designers riff on Celtic knots for album covers, their intricate loops echoing the Book of Kells. Tattoo artists trace initials in Gothic script, transforming skin into living vellum. Even blockbuster films like The Lord of the Rings borrow from medieval marginalia. The swirling maps of Middle-earth, the elvish scripts glowing like gilded letters, all owe a debt to those anonymous scribes. Video games like The Witcher cram bestiaries with creatures that wouldn't look out of place in a 13th century Psalter. They're fantastical beasts nodding to the hybrid monsters that once grinned from parchment margins. The tools have changed, but the ethos remains. Modern calligraphers mix their own iron gall ink, just as medieval scribes did, though now they might document the recipe on Instagram. Workshops teach gilding techniques to hobbyists who will never set foot in a monastery, but who still crave the tactile joy of pressing gold to paper. Even the mistakes feel familiar, a smudged line, a misplaced stroke, reminding us that perfection was never the point. The point was the devotion in the doing. What's most striking is how these revivals aren't nostalgic. They're rebellious. In an age of disposable content and pixel-perfect fonts, choosing to labor over a single letter for hours feels radical. When a tattoo artist spends weeks designing a sleeve inspired by the Gospels, or a filmmaker storyboards a scene to mimic the layered chaos of the Cairo page, they're pushing back against the rush of modernity. They're insisting that some things, beauty, patience, the weight of history, can't be streamlined. The scribes would likely nod in recognition. After all, they too lived in turbulent times, their quiet scriptoriums buffeted by Viking raids and political upheaval. Yet they kept illuminating, not because it was efficient, but because it mattered. Today's artists, whether they wield a quill or a stylus, carry forward that same stubborn faith, the belief that creating something lasting, something luminous, is worth every painstaking stroke. Behind every illuminated manuscript, beneath every gilded letter, there was a person, a scribe whose name history often erased. These weren't just skilled hands transcribing words. They were scholars who debated theology in the margins, artists who breathed life into parchment, and linguists bridging Greek, Latin, and local dialects. Consider the Venerable, an 8th century monk who didn't just copy texts. He revolutionized how history was written, weaving astronomy, medicine, and poetry into his works. Or Of, whose visionary manuscripts blended science and mysticism, her vibrant illustrations predating Renaissance anatomical studies by centuries. These scribes were polymaths, their quills as vital as any sword or crown in shaping the medieval world. What's often overlooked is the intellectual labor behind their work. A scribe copying Aristotle's lost works didn't just reproduce letters. They deciphered smudged or damaged originals, filling gaps with educated guesses. Some manuscripts contain layers of annotations, like a 9th century copy of Consolation of Philosophy, where a scribe's interlinear notes reveal fierce debates about fate and free will. These weren't passive copyists. They were active participants in the evolution of ideas. Imagine the pressure. One mistranslated word in a medical text could mean life or death for a patient centuries later. Yet for all their influence, scribes rarely claimed credit. Most worked anonymously, their identities swallowed by time. A rare exception is Of, who signed his Gospels with a humble colophon, but even he framed it as devotion, not pride. Compare that to the lavishly funded cathedrals and castles bearing patrons' names, and the imbalance is stark. Kings and popes commissioned manuscripts, but it was the scribe's hand that turned gold and ink into something transcendent. Reconstructing their lives isn't easy, but fragments survive. Account books from French monasteries note scribes receiving extra wine during winter, a small mercy for fingers stiffened by cold. A German manuscript contains a plea, "Pray for the scribe, for his eyes grow dim." Some left cheeky asides, like the monk who wrote, "3 fingers hold the pen, but the whole body aches." These glimpses remind us that these weren't mythical figures, but humans, exhausted, proud, sometimes frustrated, yet driven by a purpose larger than themselves. Their legacy is measured not in fame, but in what endured. When Charlemagne wanted to standardize education across his empire, it was scribes who unified messy regional scripts into the clear Carolingian minuscule, the ancestor of today's lowercase letters. When Arabic scientific texts reached medieval Europe, scribes translated them, preserving advances in algebra and astronomy that would fuel the Renaissance. Even the layout of modern books, paragraphs, punctuation, page numbers, stems from their innovations. Recognizing these quiet laborers reshapes how we see history. Progress isn't just the flash of battles or coronations. It's also the slow, steadfast work of those who ensure knowledge outlives empires. Next time you skim a page, spare a thought for the scribes, the ones who proved that saving the world doesn't always require a sword. Sometimes it just takes a steady hand, a sharp quill, and the patience to believe that words, too, can be eternal. The quiet hum of a convent scriptorium might not sound like a revolutionary space, but behind those walls, women were rewriting history, literally. While monks often dominate our image of medieval scribes, nuns wielded quills with equal devotion, creating illuminated manuscripts that rivaled those of their male counterparts. Take of the 12th century abbess who's fused theology with radiant visions, its pages alive with apocalyptic towers and celestial wheels painted in hues of lapis and gold. Her work wasn't just copying, it was revelation, blending science, mysticism, and art in ways that still stagger scholars today. Or consider of whose Garden of Delights became a sprawling encyclopedia for her nuns, crammed with philosophy, poetry, and whimsical marginalia like a nun riding a centaur. These weren't mere. They were intellectuals shaping medieval thought from the cloister's quiet corners. Convent scriptoriums operated differently from monastic ones. Without access to the same resources, nuns often repurposed materials, scraping old manuscripts to reuse parchment, mixing pigments from garden herbs, or stitching fragments into patchwork volumes. Their works tended to be more personal, too. A psalter made in a German convent might include prayers tailored to the sisters, daily rhythms, or delicate drawings of the Virgin Mary that mirrored the abbess's own features. Some manuscripts even bear traces of their creators' lives. A smudged fingerprint where a nun paused to wipe her brow, or a tiny doodle of a cat curled beside an inkwell, a silent companion in the long hours of labor. What's groundbreaking is how these women navigated, and sometimes circumvented, the limits placed on them. In an era when female literacy was often discouraged, convents became sanctuaries of learning. Noble families sometimes sent daughters to nunneries not just for piety, but for education, knowing the scriptorium offered skills rare for women elsewhere. A well-born nun might master Latin, astronomy, even medicine through her work copying texts. And while male scribes typically anonymized their labor, women like the English nun signed their names proudly, etching their identities into the margins of history. Their legacy cracks open stereotypes. Medieval women weren't just passive recipients of knowledge, they were its architects. The Canticles, a stunning devotional book from a 14th century convent, includes diagrams of the cosmos so precise they rival modern infographics. The Codex, co-created by a nun and a monk, proves collaboration across genders wasn't just possible, it produced masterpieces. Even the so-called nuns' stitches in bookbinding, tiny, meticulous repairs, reveal a reverence for preservation that kept fragile texts alive for centuries. Yet their stories were nearly erased. Many convent manuscripts were lost during the Reformation, their pages scattered or burned. Others were later to monks, their female creators erased by historians who couldn't imagine such artistry coming from a woman's hand. Today, as scholars rediscover these works, they're not just correcting the record, they're revealing a Middle Ages far more dynamic than we knew. When a nun in Switzerland painted a self-portrait into her manuscript, in the 15th century, she left more than art. She left a challenge, to see the past not as a monolith, but as a tapestry woven by countless hands, some holding quills inked with defiance and gold. To commission an illuminated manuscript in the Middle Ages wasn't just an artistic choice. It was a financial flex on par with buying a private island today. Take the Great Canterbury Psalter, a 12th century masterpiece whose production cost was equivalent to a skilled laborer's wages for 15 years. That price tag wasn't just for the labor. It included vellum from 200 sheep, gold leaf hauled across Europe, and ultramarine blue pigment worth its weight in silver. Only two groups could afford such extravagance: the church and the crown. Bishops ordered lavish liturgical books to showcase their diocese's wealth, while kings like Charlemagne used them as diplomatic tools, gifting illuminated gospels to allies as geopolitical chess moves wrapped in gilded leather. But the real power players were often unseen. Wealthy merchants and nobles, hungry for social climbing, bankrolled personal prayer books called Books of Hours. These weren't just devotional aids, they were medieval LinkedIn profiles. A burgher in 15th century Bruges might commission a miniature of himself kneeling piously beside the Virgin Mary, a not-so-subtle hint that his money came with divine approval. Some patrons even inserted their coats of arms into biblical scenes, as if their ancestors had personally witnessed the crucifixion. The message was clear: salvation might be priceless, but status was for sale. The economics dictated more than just vanity. Because patrons called the shots, their biases shaped what survived. A French duke favoring hunting scenes meant illuminators painted more stags than saints, while a convent's request for female martyrs preserved stories of early Christian heroines that might otherwise have faded. But the system had cracks. Some scribes, tired of aristocratic whims, snuck subversive details into margins, like a bishop's face on a donkey or a moneylender roasting in hell. Even the wealthiest patron couldn't fully control the hands holding the brushes. What's haunting is what didn't make the cut. Peasant traditions, vernacular poetry, and dissenting theological texts rarely got the golden treatment. The voices preserved in Illumination were those of the elite, their priorities fossilized in vellum and lapis lazuli. Yet in a twist of irony, those very biases now help us decode medieval power structures. When a Flemish guild's account book includes an illuminated border, it whispers that commerce was gaining ground over feudal loyalty. When a queen's psalter shows her crowned by angels, it shouts how monarchy and divinity were merging. The true cost of these books wasn't just counted in coins. Every illuminated manuscript was a bargain struck between art and authority, where beauty served as both gift and weapon. Today, as we marvel at their brilliance, we're also reading the fine print of a deal made centuries ago, one that traded gold for glory and parchment for permanence. The glow of illuminated manuscripts wasn't confined to Europe's scriptoriums. It flickered across continents, each culture imprinting its own genius onto parchment and vellum. In the Islamic world, where figurative art was often avoided, scribes turned letters into landscapes. A single page from a 13th century might unfold like a garden of geometry, with arabesques twisting around Kufic calligraphy so precise it seems etched by compass. Gold wasn't just decoration. It was a metaphor for divine light, pooling in the curves of sacred verses. These artists elevated writing to worship. They're intricate, those marginal flourishes resembling vines, echoing the infinite patterns found in mosque mosaics. Byzantine workshops took a different path, fusing Greek philosophy with Christian devotion. Open a 9th century, and you'll find saints framed by columns ripped straight from Roman temples, their halos glowing like miniature suns. Constantinople's artists were masters of layered meaning. A depiction of the Annunciation might include a tiny peacock, its iridescent feathers symbolizing immortality, while the Virgin's blue robe, painted with Armenian cochineal, whispered of far-flung trade networks. Even the pigments told stories. Purple pages signaled imperial patronage. Since the dye came from mollusks so rare, their harvest was restricted by law. Then there's Ethiopia's Gospels, hidden for centuries in a monastery perched high in the Tigray Mountains. Carbon dated to the 5th or 6th century, its vivid portraits of the evangelists defy time with colors still blazing, yellows from volcanic earth, deep reds from crushed insects. Unlike European manuscripts, where figures often float in gold abstraction, art feels grounded. The Apostle Mark gazes out with wide, watchful eyes, his robes patterned in crosses that mirror the rock-hewn churches of. This wasn't just imitation. It was a distinctly African expression of faith, where Coptic and indigenous traditions wove together like the threads of a cloak. Journey east to Armenia, and you'll find the Gospels, its pages alive with dragon-tailed letters and monks battling literal demons in the margins. Persian influences peek through in the floral motifs, while the portraits of King M and Queen, tucked beside biblical scenes, reveal a monarchy staking its legitimacy on divine connection. Over in Tibet, Buddhist manuscripts took illumination to 3 dimensions. Pages layered with powdered gold and mineral paints so thick they cast shadows, each sutra a tactile offering to the gods. What binds these traditions isn't just beauty, but purpose. Whether it's a Jewish Haggadah from medieval Spain with Passover scenes gilded like royal tapestries, or a Mayan codex folding astronomy into bark paper accordions, humans everywhere have reached for the same truth. Words alone aren't enough. They must be wrapped in splendor, because sacred stories deserve sacred vessels. The difference is Islamic avoidance of figuration, Ethiopia's bold portraiture, Byzantium's classical echoes, aren't contradictions. They're proof that illumination wasn't a single flame, but countless sparks igniting wherever hands dared to turn language into light. The dazzling blues and radiant reds glowing from medieval manuscripts weren't just artistic choices. They were feats of alchemy, geography, and sheer audacity. Take ultramarine blue, the most coveted pigment of all, painstakingly ground from lapis lazuli stones hauled over mountains from Afghanistan's remote mines. Imagine the journey. Camel caravans carrying raw lapis along the Silk Road, Venetian merchants trading it for gold by the ounce, and finally, monks in a French scriptorium crushing it into powder with mortar and pestle. The process was so labor-intensive that this blue became more precious than gold itself, reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary or the heavens in sacred scenes. Artists joked that using it carelessly was like scattering ducats into the sea. But brilliance came at a price. Vermilion red, that fiery hue leaping from initials and martyrs' cloaks, was born from mercury sulfide, a toxic mineral that could poison scribes through fumes or mere touch. Workers in Spanish mines, where cinnabar ore was dug up, often suffered tremors and madness, earning the pigment the grim nickname dragon's blood. Even safer-seeming greens carried risks. Malachite, mined in Hungary and Cyprus, released toxic dust when ground, while verdigris, created by suspending copper plates over vinegar, could eat through parchment if mixed incorrectly. These weren't just colors, they were negotiations with danger, where every stroke of the brush flirted with peril. Yet the palette didn't end there. White came from lead carbonate, a pigment so sweet-tasting that Renaissance artists reportedly nibbled their brushes, a habit that likely contributed to chronic illness. Yellow, often derived from orpiment, an arsenic-laced mineral that reacted violently with other pigments, sometimes causing illuminated letters to literally eat through pages over centuries. And then there was the humble brown, made from iron-rich earth or even, in a macabre twist, mummified corpses ground into mummy brown, a practice that persisted until artists realized they were painting with actual human remains. What's revelatory isn't just the risks, but the global tapestry these pigments reveal. Ultramarine tied European monasteries to Afghan mountains. Cochineal red connected Spanish Bibles to Aztec dye vats in Mexico. Even black ink, usually boiled from oak galls, relied on wasp-induced tree growths harvested in German forests. Each color was a fingerprint of trade routes, colonial expansion, and ecological knowledge, a medieval version of today's supply chains, but with far deadlier workplace hazards. Modern science lets us peer deeper into this chromatic legacy. X-ray fluorescence scans of manuscripts uncover lost layers. A saint's face originally painted in costly lapis, then downgraded to cheaper azurite when funds ran low. In London's library, a 15th century medical manuscript's green borders tested positive for arsenic, likely explaining the scribe's marginal note complaining of headaches. These aren't just art histories, they're detective stories, where pigments become clues to unraveling the lives of those who worked with them. The scribes knew the dangers. Recipes for vermilion warned to work near an open window, while lapis grinders wore cloth masks centuries before OSHA. Yet they persisted, driven by a belief that divine beauty demanded earthly sacrifice. Holding a manuscript today, we're not just seeing colors, we're touching the residue of courage, ingenuity, and sometimes desperation, all bottled in tiny jars of powdered stone and poison. Every radiant page is a testament to how far humans will go to trap light in pigment, and how tightly art and risk have always been intertwined. The curves of early medieval script tell a silent story of cultural upheaval. Uncial, the dominant script of late antiquity, flowed across parchment with rounded majesty, its broad, open letters like the arches of a Roman aqueduct. This wasn't just aesthetics, it was necessity. Parchment was scarce, and the uncluttered strokes of uncial made texts legible even by flickering candlelight. But as Europe fractured into kingdoms, so too did its handwriting. By the 8th century, scribes in Charlemagne's court were crafting a revolution, Carolingian minuscule. Imagine the shock of a monk used to uncial's stately pace suddenly seeing these tight, lowercase letters, uniform, efficient, and cramming twice the text onto a single page. This wasn't just a new font. It was the medieval equivalent of switching from stone tablets to text messages. Then came Gothic script, the jagged heartbeat of the High Middle Ages. Where Carolingian letters had breathed with Roman clarity, Gothic script rose like cathedral spires, vertical, compressed, every stroke straining toward heaven. The denseness wasn't accidental. As universities boomed and demand for books exploded, scribes needed to save space. A single Gothic page could hold a small treatise, its ink-black letters bristling with abbreviations like medieval shorthand. But there was a cost: readability. One 14th century scholar grumbled that Gothic script looked as if someone had scattered twigs across the page. Yet within these shifts lay fierce regional pride. Spanish scribes clung to Visigothic script long after it faded elsewhere, their letters looping like Moorish calligraphy in quiet defiance of Frankish influence. In Ireland, insular script, with its serpentine knots and dots, became a badge of Celtic identity, so distinctive that the Book of Kells remains instantly recognizable 12 centuries later. Even tiny variations spoke volumes. The delicate flourishes of Italian Gothic whispered of Renaissance humanism creeping in, while German scribes leaned into angularity, their letters as sharp as black forest pines. What's astonishing is how these scribes, working centuries apart, built the alphabet we use today. That lowercase g in your browser. Thank Carolingian scribes who standardized letter forms. The italics in your email, born from the swift, slanted hands of Venetian clerks. Every time you jot a note, you're wielding tools forged in medieval scriptoriums, proof that writing isn't just about words, but the shapes that carry them across time. The next time you flip through a book, look closely. Those letters on the page, they're not just ink. They're the fingerprints of 1,000 unnamed scribes, each stroke a bridge between their world and ours. Picture a vast stone hall, its narrow windows filtering pale morning light onto rows of wooden desks. Here, in the monastic scriptorium, the air hums with the quiet intensity of quills scratching parchment, a sound as rhythmic as the prayers marking each hour. These weren't just workspaces, they were ecosystems of intellect, where scribes, illustrators, and binders moved in a carefully choreographed dance of creation. Silence ruled, not as punishment, but as sacred discipline. The only interruptions, the soft clink of ink pots, the occasional cough, or the turning of a vellum page. In an age of chaos, Viking raids, plagues, feudal wars, the scriptorium was a fortress of order, where knowledge was both shield and sword. Monastic life revolved around the rule of saint, which carved the day into precise segments: prayer, labor, study. Scribes worked primarily in the morning light, their hands steadier in the cold quiet before fatigue set in. Afternoons might shift to grinding pigments or preparing parchment, tasks demanding less precision but equal care. Every activity, from copying scripture to stitching bindings, was framed as an act of devotion. A Benedictine motto put it plainly: to work is to pray. This wasn't just efficiency. It was a spiritual alchemy, transforming manual labor into meditation. Collaboration thrived in unexpected ways. A single manuscript might pass through a dozen hands, a junior monk pricking guide holes in the margins, a senior scribe laying down the text in disciplined rows, an illustrator breathing life into initials with vines and beasts, and finally, a binder assembling the pages into a codex sturdy enough to outlast empires. Specialization was fierce. Some monks became masters of historiated initials, those elaborate letters housing entire biblical scenes, while others excelled in rubrication, adding crimson titles that popped like jewels against the page. Yet scriptoriums were more than book factories. They were medieval think tanks. In the margins of theological texts, scribes debated Aristotle's logic or puzzled over Arabic numerals newly arrived from Muslim Spain. Glosses, those handwritten notes crowding the edges of pages, reveal lively intellectual sparring. One 11th century monk scribbled beside a passage on free will. But what of predestination? Discuss. These annotations are like overhearing a medieval book club, where classical philosophy and Christian doctrine collided to spark new ideas. The scriptorium's influence ripples into modern life in ways we rarely notice. The very structure of books, chapters, indexes, even punctuation, was refined in these halls. When a Carolingian scribe standardized lowercase letters for readability, he was designing a system we still use today. Universities inherited the scriptorium's ethos, with libraries echoing the monastic vow to preserve and share knowledge. Even the modern workday, segmented into focused sprints, mirrors the Benedictine balance of labor and rest. What's haunting is how fragile this system was. A single fire, like the one that ravaged the library of Abbey in the 18th century, could erase centuries of labor in an afternoon. Yet what survived? The Book of Kells, the Gospels, the countless unnamed psalters, testifies to a truth these monks understood. Civilization isn't built on battles or crowns, but on the patient, ink-stained hands who choose to carry light forward, one word at a time. At first glance, those oversized, swirling letters opening each chapter of a medieval manuscript seem like pure decoration. But lean closer, and an entire world unfolds inside a single initial. Historians call them historiated initials, and they're far more than ornamental flourishes. Imagine a capital D that doesn't just start the word, but contains within its curves a scene of David slaying Goliath, the stone mid-flight, the giant's face frozen in shock. These weren't whimsical doodles. They were visual shorthand, distilling complex narratives into a space no larger than a postage stamp. Take the 12th century Winchester Bible, where the letter B at the beginning of the book of Genesis cradles a tiny, vibrant creation story. God's hand emerging from the stem of the letter to touch Adam's finger, while Eve curls near the base like a natural extension of the typography. The effect is deliberate. The shape of the letter mirrors the arc of creation itself, binding form and meaning into a single glance. For illiterate congregants hearing the text read aloud, These initials acted as anchor points, their vivid scenes reinforcing the priest's words. Even literate monks, poring over theological tracts, relied on them as cognitive landmarks in dense seas of text. Patrons, too, found their way into the alphabet. The lavish riches of Jean Barry sneaks the Duke's portrait into the K of Kalins, his stern face peering from the letter's spine like a monarch claiming dominion over time itself. Other initials became covert political commentary. In one 14th century psalter, the Q of Quid, why do you boast, frames a bishop with donkey ears, a silent jab at clerical corruption, tucked where only the sharpest-eyed reader might catch it. The artistry behind these letters reveals medieval minds thinking in layers. A single initial might encode multiple meanings. The M of the Magnificat cradling the Virgin Mary, not just as illustration, but as theological argument, her presence in the letter visually affirming her role as the gateway to the Incarnation. Zoom in further, and you'll spot subversions. A particularly rebellious scribe might tuck a grinning gargoyle into the crook of an A, or a barefoot peasant stealing grapes inside a V, reminding viewers that even sacred texts couldn't escape the humor and grit of daily life. What's miraculous is how these tiny canvases survived centuries of wear. The gold leaf still catches light. The lapis lazuli blues retain their depth. And if you run a finger along the edge of a digitized page, you can almost feel the raised gesso where the artist built up the letters like miniature topographies. They're not just letters to be read, but artifacts to be experienced. Proof that in the Middle Ages, even the alphabet wasn't just a tool, but a theater of the divine, the political, and the profoundly human. Long before textbooks and tablets, knowledge lived in the weight of parchment, and it was anything but static. In the lecture halls of medieval universities like Paris and Bologna, illuminated manuscripts weren't just reference materials. They were the beating heart of education. A single copy of Decretum, the foundational text of canon law, might pass through generations of students, its margins crammed with layer upon layer of annotations, debates, counterarguments, even doodles of grumpy professors. These glosses transformed pages into living conversations, where a 12th century scholar's critique could spar with a 10th century monk's interpretation, all in the cramped handwriting of those who came after. This wasn't just note-taking. It was the medieval equivalent of a collaborative Google Doc, where every reader left their mark. The power of illumination went far beyond decoration. In medical schools like Salerno, intricate diagrams of the human body, veins branching like rivers, organs color-coded with earthy pigments, turned abstract theories into visual roadmaps. A student struggling to memorize Galen's humoral theory could trace the 4 temperaments in the faces of saints painted beside the text. Sanguine cheerfulness in a rosy-cheeked apostle, brooding in a shadowed prophet. These weren't flourishes. They were cognitive tools, leveraging color and image to anchor concepts in memory centuries before the term visual learning existed. Cathedral schools took this further, using manuscripts as multimedia teaching aids. A Bible might include musical notation hovering above psalms, allowing choir boys to learn neumes, early musical notes, while studying scripture. The of Seville, a sprawling 7th century encyclopedia, paired dense Latin with whimsical marginal beasts to explain natural phenomena. A manticore illustrating exotic zoology, a phoenix rising from flames to symbolize resurrection. For students navigating texts in their non-native Latin, these images acted as guideposts, turning foreign words into familiar scenes. What's often overlooked is how this system democratized access. While a single manuscript was costly, its knowledge radiated outward. A master at Oxford would read aloud from an illuminated Aristotle while students clustered around, their own wax tablets capturing key phrases. The book itself might be chained to a desk, not to hoard knowledge, but to ensure it stayed within reach of all. Even illiterate artisans learned through osmosis, absorbing biblical stories from the stained glass and frescoes that echoed manuscript illuminations in their local churches. The legacy of this visual pedagogy lingers in modern classrooms. When a biology textbook color codes cell structures or a history app embeds interactive timelines, it's channeling the same instinct that made medieval scribes sketch crusader routes in the margins of chronicles. The glosses of yore evolved into today's footnotes and hyperlinks, layers of dialogue across time. Those illuminated pages didn't just store information. They modeled how to think, questioning, connecting, imagining. In an age of digital overload, there's quiet wisdom in their example. Real learning isn't about consuming content, but conversing with it, one luminous page at a time. Beneath the gold leaf and vibrant pigments of illuminated manuscripts lies a shadowy world of greed and deception. In 2011, the Codex, a 12th century pilgrimage guide cherished as the jewel of Spain's Santiago, vanished from its secure vault. Thieves bypassed alarms and cameras, leaving behind an empty case where the manuscript had rested for centuries. The theft wasn't just a crime against a library. It was an assault on cultural memory, severing a tangible link to medieval pilgrims who'd trekked across Europe. When police recovered the Codex a year later, found stashed in a garage alongside unrelated loot, the relief was palpable, but the vulnerability it exposed remains. This wasn't an isolated incident. From Cairo to Oxford, rare manuscripts continue to disappear, smuggled through underground networks where their value isn't measured in historical significance, but in black market price tags. Even more insidious than theft is the deliberate dismantling of intact manuscripts. Dealers chasing higher profits often slice single pages from codices, selling them as artworks to collectors who prize beauty over context. A 15th century book of hours might be dismembered, its calendar pages scattered across continents, January in Tokyo, June in New York, leaving scholars to piece together its story like detectives solving a fragmented puzzle. The practice isn't new. In the 19th century, Victorian collectors routinely cut up medieval manuscripts to decorate screens or albums, treating them as mere craft supplies. But today's market accelerates the destruction, with digital auctions enabling anonymous buyers to bid on illuminated initials or miniatures torn from their original folios. Each sale chips away at the manuscript's soul, reducing a unified work of devotion into disconnected scraps. Forgery adds another layer of deceit. Advanced techniques allow criminals to age modern vellum with tea stains or replicate medieval pigments, almost. In 2019, a fragment supposedly from a rare French breviary was exposed as fake when ultraviolet light revealed titanium white, a 20th century pigment. Other forgers exploit gaps in provenance, attaching legitimate ownership histories to fabricated leaves. The damage isn't just financial, it erodes trust. When museums hesitate to acquire potential treasures for fear of fakes, genuine artifacts risk being overlooked. Combating these threats demands global cooperation. Databases like the International Foundation for Art Research catalog stolen manuscripts, while libraries employ multispectral imaging to verify authenticity. Some institutions refuse to purchase single leaves, starving the market of incentives to break books apart. But the real change begins with awareness. Every time a visitor admires an intact manuscript in a museum rather than a fragmented page in a private collection, they're casting a vote for preservation over plunder. These aren't just old books, they're time capsules of human ingenuity, and their survival depends on recognizing that their true value can't be measured in gold leaf or auction bids, but in the stories they carry across centuries. The luminous legacy of medieval manuscripts didn't fade with the printing press. It simply evolved, resurfacing in the hands of modern book artists who channel the same alchemy of word and image. Take William Blake, the 18th century poet-painter whose illuminated books like Songs of Innocence fused handwritten verse with swirling watercolors, each page a deliberate echo of monastic craftsmanship. Blake didn't just write poems, he built them like a scribe, etching text and illustration onto copper plates so they'd emerge from the press as unified visions. His process, though mechanized, retained the medieval ethos that a book should be more than a container for ideas, it should be an artifact of wonder. Fast forward to today, and artists like push the boundaries further. Her series features laser-cut layers that unfold into sculptural landscapes, where readers physically navigate text like pilgrims winding through a manuscript's margins. This work recalls the tactile intimacy of a medieval psalter, where flipping a gilded page felt like stepping into sacred space. Even her materials whisper of tradition: handmade papers, letterpressing type, and occasional touches of gold leaf, bridging centuries with a single gesture. But you don't need a studio or rare pigments to carry the scribe's torch. The DIY zine movement, with its pages and stapled spines, is a rebellious descendant of the scriptorium. May trade vellum for and quills for Sharpies, but their ethos mirrors the medieval monks. That creating books by hand is an act of resistance against mass production, against disposable culture. When a punk musician crafts a zine in a basement, or a teenager stitches chapbooks for friends, they're participating in the same ritual that once filled monastic halls. The stubborn belief that words deserve to be handled with care. Digital tools haven't erased this impulse, they've expanded it. Graphic designers manipulate pixels to mimic the interplay of text and ornament found in the Book of Kells, while ebook apps experiment with animations that make initials bloom, like historiated letters come to life. Even emoji, those tiny modern hieroglyphs, function like marginalia, visual shorthand that punctuates our texts with playful emotion, much like a grinning grotesque peeking from a psalm. What binds these threads together isn't just technique, but intention. Whether it's a medieval monk spending years on a single Bible or a contemporary artist folding origami into a narrative, the drive remains: to make books that demand to be experienced, not just read. In an age of infinite scrolling and disposable content, this lineage reminds us that some stories are worth slowing down for, worth holding in your hands, worth gilding, if not with gold leaf, then with time and attention. The scribes may have traded quills for styluses, but their mission endures: to turn pages into portals, where every word and image hums with the possibility of revelation. A medieval monk hunched over his desk could never have imagined that one day, his painstakingly illuminated page would be visible to someone halfway across the world with just a tap of a finger. Yet here we are, in an age where technology has flung open the doors of once inaccessible scriptoriums, turning exclusive treasures into shared wonders. The British Library's Manuscripts project alone offers thousands of high-resolution scans, each click revealing details invisible to the naked eye. The raised texture of gold leaf, the faintest pencil sketches beneath layers of paint, even the tooth marks of vellum where the parchment was stretched centuries ago. Zoom in on the Gospels, and you'll spot individual brush hairs frozen in pigment. Rotate the virtual pages of the Lisbon Hebrew Bible, and its Arabic-influenced illuminations glow as if lit by medieval candlelight. This isn't just viewing, it's forensic exploration, letting us study these works with a closeness even their creators never experienced. But digital access does more than magnify, it resurrects. The Forensa 121 project uses multispectral imaging to uncover texts erased from medieval palimpsests, pages scraped clean and reused, their original words lurking beneath like ghosts. In Austria, the Archimedes palimpsest project revealed 10th century Byzantine prayers hiding a far older prize, erased treatises by the ancient Greek mathematician, now readable through ultraviolet light. Most hauntingly, virtual reconstructions breathe life into lost manuscripts. The Cotton Library fire of 1731 charred priceless Anglo-Saxon works like the Beowulf manuscript, leaving edges brittle as autumn leaves. Yet through 3D modeling and spectral analysis, scholars have digitally unburned sections, teasing out letters from the scorch marks. It's as close to time travel as we've come, a second chance for voices nearly silenced by history. The democratizing power of this technology can't be overstated. A student in Mumbai can examine the same book of Kells folios as a Dublin professor, while a calligrapher in Tokyo studies Carolingian minuscule from scans as crisp as the originals. Social media amplifies this further. The museum's cute medieval animals thread showcased whimsical marginal beasts to millions, proving that 900-year-old doodles can still trend. Interactive features deepen the connection. The Vatican's digital library lets users turn pages of the codex with a swipe, while apps like the Smithfield Decretals overlay translations when you tap a Latin phrase. Suddenly, manuscripts aren't relics behind glass. They're living texts, inviting annotation and debate just as they did in medieval margins. Yet for all its miracles, the digital realm can't replicate the aura of standing before an illuminated page, the way gold leaf catches light differently at every angle, or how vellum softens with centuries of handling. What it can do, though, is fulfill the scribe's deepest purpose: to scatter knowledge like seeds. When a monk inked prayers onto parchment, he dreamed they'd outlast him. Now, thanks to pixels and passion, his work whispers not just to a chosen few in a cloister, but to anyone with curiosity and an internet connection. The screens we hold today are the modern equivalent of those glowing scriptorium desks, vessels for the same human hunger to create, preserve, and connect across the abyss of time. For those medieval scribes bent over their desks in candlelit scriptoriums, each stroke of the quill was a whispered prayer. They didn't just copy scripture, they embodied it, their hands moving in rhythms that mirrored the chants rising from the monastery chapel below. The rule of saint had decreed that idle hands were the devil's playground, but these scribes transformed labor into liturgy. To them, the very act of writing was a sacrament, an idea captured in the colophon of one 12th century psalter, where a monk penned, "As the gardener tends his plot, so I tend God's word, that it may bear fruit in the hearts of men." The ink wasn't just pigment, it was a covenant between the human and the divine. This sacred dimension bled into every material choice. Vellum, scraped clean of hair and blemishes, mirrored the soul's purification. Gold leaf wasn't mere decoration. It was the light of heaven made tangible, pressed onto the page like a seal of the sacred. Even mistakes carried spiritual weight. Some scribes, upon spotting an error, would add a tiny cross in the margin as both apology and absolution, treating each flaw as a chance for humility. The most devout went further. In the Bible, a Cistercian monk illustrated the O in meaning all as a labyrinth, inviting the reader to trace the path with their finger as a miniature pilgrimage. Proof that every element, down to a single letter, could be a portal to devotion. Modern calligraphers echo this reverence, even if their tools have evolved. Japanese master calligrapher Koji describes the act of writing kanji as moving meditation, where breath and brushstrokes synchronize in a dance of discipline. In Turkey, the ancient art of Islamic calligraphy still adorns mosques with verses, each curve calibrated to reflect divine harmony. Even secular artists speak of flow states while lettering, that timeless sensation where time dissolves and the hand seems guided by something beyond the self. The vocabulary may have changed, but the essence remains. The scribe's belief that beauty and spirit are woven from the same thread. What's striking is how this spiritual legacy transcends religion. The medieval scribe's devotion to craft finds kinship in today's slow movements, from handmade books to artisanal ceramics, where creators chase not efficiency, but meaning. When a contemporary artist spends months gilding a single page with techniques unchanged since Charlemagne's era, they're not just preserving tradition. They're answering the same quiet call that echoed in scriptoriums, that some acts are sacred not because of their product, but because of the presence poured into them. The parchment may fade, the inks may crack, but the scribe's deepest lesson endures. That hands engaged in holy work, however humble, leave marks even time can't erase. The art of illuminated manuscripts is more than just a relic of the past. It's a mirror reflecting humanity's endless drive to create, preserve, and find meaning in beauty. Those medieval scribes, hunched over their desks with quills in hand, weren't just copying words. They were spinning light into parchment, turning ink into devotion, and safeguarding the fragile threads of knowledge through wars, plagues, and the slow erosion of time. Their names may have faded, but their fingerprints linger everywhere. In the elegant fonts on our screens, the illustrated borders of modern graphic novels, even the way we still pause to admire a book with a beautifully crafted cover. These unsung heroes remind us that brilliance isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet persistence of a single stroke, repeated until it becomes something timeless. What's astonishing is how their legacy refuses to stay confined to history. Graphic designers today borrow the intricate of Celtic manuscripts for logos. Tattoo artists trace Gothic lettering onto skin, turning bodies into living vellum. And in classrooms, students still marvel at digitized pages of the Book of Kells, their eyes widening at the same details that mesmerized monks 12 centuries ago. The scribes' greatest triumph wasn't just the books they left behind. It was proving that art and knowledge are inseparable, that beauty isn't frivolous but fundamental to how we understand the world. So the next time you run your fingers over a finely printed page or lose yourself in the margins of a sketchbook, remember, you're part of a chain that stretches back to those dim scriptoriums. Every handwritten note, every painstakingly crafted design carries echoes of their discipline and vision. And if this journey through illuminated manuscripts has reminded you of anything, let it be this: history's most enduring treasures weren't made for fame or fortune, but for the simple, radical belief that some things are worth doing slowly, carefully, and with all the light you can muster. If these stories resonated with you, share your favorite discovery in the comments, and keep the conversation alive by subscribing for more adventures into the past's hidden corners. The scribes may have put down their quills, but their story is far